I want to talk a bit about something which in my opinion is a very dark part of our past in this country. And it's something that is still goes on around the world. Each country has different legislation regarding this. I'm talking about the death penalty. I wasn't sort of holding that back for sort of effect or anything. I'm talking about the death penalty, and I want to discuss it a bit specifically in the context of the UK. This is not a video about the contemporary death penalty around the world, because there's a lot of ins and outs with that, and I've already covered that in other videos. I want to talk specifically about, well, actually not just the death penalty, also general punishments that we had in the past in this country. And I'll probably make more than one video for this, because there's quite a lot to cover. And it's not going to be exhaustive. I'm not going to go through every single detail, but I want to discuss this in our history, and hopefully lay out the reasons why I believe it should be part of our past and not something that is reintroduced. I guess what's prompted me to do this is two things. One was a source I came across online a few days ago, discussing public hangings at Tyburn. I mean, this is stuff I knew anyway, but this was another angle that was particularly detailed, and it has prompted me to think about this. And the other thing was a mockumentary about Gary Glitter. Now, the last video I made before this was about Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harrison, notorious sex offenders. Gary Glitter was another example, and this mockumentary sort of presented a scenario whereby, I didn't watch it all, I just watched a few clips from it, but I got the idea. And it presented a scenario whereby the death penalty had been reintroduced in this country, and Gary Glitter was sentenced to death, and it showed what that sort of situation might look like if it happened today. First of all, I'll start with the last executions in this country that were actually carried out. They weren't the last executions to be passed as a sentence, because there were several, the death penalty wasn't actually completely abolished until, I believe it was 1967. But the last executions to be actually carried out in this country were in England in 1960. I say in England because I'm talking about the wider UK. In 1964. I believe the last executions in Scotland and Northern Ireland were in 1961. I'm not sure about the last execution in Wales. But the last executions were of two young men who had supposedly killed a police officer, John Allen West. My mistake, he wasn't a police officer, he was a driver for a laundry. The two young men who were executed were Gwyn Evans and Peter Allen. To give them the full names, Gwyn Owen Evans and Peter Anthony Allen. I'm not going to go into the details of that case, but it was a murder case, and both these guys were found guilty of their part in that murder. I'm not going into details simply as a time factor, but you can look up the case yourself. So those executions were carried out simultaneously, but in different prisons. Peter Anthony Allen was hanged on the, I'm just looking at this directly from Wikipedia. Peter Anthony Allen was hanged at 8 AM at Walton Prison in Liverpool by Robert Leslie Stewart. And at exactly the same time, Gwyn Evans was hanged at Manchester at Strangeways Prison by Harry Allen, 8 AM 13th of August 1964. That's almost exactly 50 years to the day, so it's quite a topical time that I'm making this video, almost exactly 50 years ago. That's quite a poignant moment, I think. It's almost half a century since we had our last executions. Now, the last public executions in Britain These were in prisons, they were private executions. The last public executions in Britain, or execution I should say, was much, much longer ago. That was in 1868, and it was one Michael Barrett, who was found guilty of his role in the Clerkenwell bombing. That was a Fenian bombing, a bombing by the Fenian Brotherhood. This was an organisation that predated the Irish Republican Army, and to the Victorians they were the terrorist organisation of the day. That was a terrorist attack that killed up to 20 people. And as he was executed, there was chants of Rule Britannia. That came at a time when there was a number of high-profile Irish Republican attacks in mainland Britain. So that was the last public execution in Britain. So in other words, this country hasn't had a public execution in, I'm going to be quite technical here, but in 146 years. We haven't had an execution of any kind in almost 50 years. So clearly this is something that is getting further and further into our past. In my opinion, that is a good thing. There's one point I would like to make before I talk a little bit about capital punishment in this country. One thing that is often assumed by people who oppose the death penalty, as I do, is that they are bleeding heart, namby-pamby liberals who have no understanding of the impact that crime has on victims, who love criminals, who are anti-justice, and so on. There's an insinuation that if you oppose the death penalty you're somehow soft on crime. I think this is very misguided. I actually regard myself as quite conservative on crime, and I often criticise sentences I regard as way too lenient, and I don't have much time for people who make excuses for criminals. I've been pretty vocal about the organisation known as the Hard League for Penal Reform. So this caricature that if you're anti-death penalty then you must be pro-criminal is just ridiculous. And it's quite lazy thinking, really. It's not a case of one or the other. I'm open-minded enough to acknowledge that not everyone who supports the death penalty is a sadist. So I would say don't judge everyone who opposes the death penalty as being as not understanding what it's like to be a victim of crime. I mean, honestly, there are crimes out there whereby I can understand why people would support the death penalty. There's some crimes so horrible that you can understand why people would support it. Take, for example, child murder, or a serial rapist, things like this. There's certain crimes that are so heinous that you can understand why society would be outraged to an extent they would say the criminal really has to suffer. But there's actually an argument to be made that the death penalty is an easy way out. That's an argument that could be made. But anyway, like I said, I don't want to go into the ins and outs about... I want to specifically focus on this video all on the history of the death penalty in this country, because the debate about it is more for another video. Okay, I am opening up a debate about it, but I simply don't have time in the video to cover all aspects of the debate. So for now I'm just going to focus on a bit of history in this country. The most common form of execution in Britain, and that was across Britain, in England, Scotland, Ireland when it was part of Great Britain, and Wales, was hanging. And there's evidence for hanging going way, way back to the Anglo-Saxon period. To give you a bit of context, that's roughly the 7th century onwards, roughly speaking. But executions actually being formally documented, the oldest record I can find of a hanging in Britain was a character called, I believe it was Henry Fitzaulwyn. He was a rebel who sort of led a early peasants' revolt in London in the year 1194. He wasn't only hanged, I believe he was drawn and quartered as well. That's one of the oldest sort of documented executions in this country. Now, later on, and particularly during the 16th century, decapitation was used specifically for nobles. For example, lords and minor members of the royal family, or not so minor in some cases. In fact, not minor at all if you're going right up to King Charles I. That was an example of regicide in Europe long before the French Revolution, when English people executed their own monarch. A very historic event. Decapitation was seen as humane, in inverted commas, and it was quick, provided the executioner was good at his job. But there were examples of it being botched, whereby the executioner literally had to chop several times. In England, the method was an axe, whereas in France the favoured method was sword. And there's a famous incident whereby Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's famous consort, she had the privilege, so-called, of choosing which weapon she would be executed by, and she chose the sword because she believed it would be faster. By the way, his fifth wife, in case you didn't know, was also executed, Catherine Hard. So nobles were executed by decapitation. Now, in London alone, I've done a bit of research on this, and I counted 109 executions by decapitation, and every one of them were either royals or aristocrats of some sort. But the vast majority of people executed, both in the capital and elsewhere, were by the method of hanging. Now, until the mid-Victorian period, that would be hanging by the neck until dead. Sorry, maybe not the mid-Victorian period, a little bit earlier. I think about the 1820s, where the felon would literally be hanging, literally. In the early 19th century, there was a replacement method whereby it would be a drop, which was a bit more humane because the neck would snap, and in most circumstances the person would die immediately. Now, the country was divided into so-called assizes, which were sort of legal jurisdictions. And that term was actually used for courts right up until modern times. I believe some places even still retain that name, assizes, but it's a traditional term that was used for a court. And there's a very good archive, which is the Newgate Calendar. You can find the website. It documents cases as they were reported at the time. Most of them are from the 18th century. Earlier cases aren't well documented. For example, before about 1720, it's quite hard to find details of specific cases. But this online archive basically documents cases from roughly 1720 to 1830, that sort of period. And it's a notable period because that's when the number of public executions was sort of at its peak. But having said that, under the reign of Henry VIII alone, just in his reign, it's estimated as many as 20,000 commoners may have been hanged for a wide range of offences. There were other forms of capital punishment, although I'm not sure I have time to cover them in this video, so I'm going to be specific with hanging. It's almost impossible to verify exactly how many people were hanged in this country over the centuries, but I would estimate it as somewhere between a minimum of 30,000 and a maximum of 100,000 in about 900 years, 800 years of hanging. So if you go from William Fitzaylwin in 1174 to the last execution in 1964, maybe between 50,000 and 100,000 people were hanged in this country. So a lot of people. Now, it's important to realise the sort of atmosphere of this time. It's a society that was so, I was going to say so alien from our own, but you can see some characteristics in modern society that you can think, well, there are people out there who would actually behave in a similar way to those who would have went to watch these executions. London, of course, being the capital, had the most executions, but other major centres were York. There were public executions in Newcastle, not far from where I am, Durham, Northampton, Surprisingly, not that many in big cities today, because at that time they were still developing as part of the Industrial Revolution. So most public executions were in smaller cities that were more traditional county towns. York was a major centre, but most of them were in London, and most decapitations of royals and so on were at the Tower of London, but commoners were mostly executed at two locations. One of them was Tyburn. That was named after a brook, a small river that ran through that part of London. And if you're wondering where that was, if you know London, it's in an area that's now known as Marble Arch, on the corner of Hyde Park. There was a Tyburn Road, which is now Oxford Street, roughly corresponding with Oxford Street. So you can imagine that's one of the busiest streets in Europe today, very busy place, the very heart of London. And it was no different then, except then it was sort of a dirt road, and it was a major thoroughfare. And the characteristic of Tyburn, the Tyburn Tree, if you want a good sort of idea of what this was, look at the film Plunkett and Maclean. There's a scene at the end of that film which shows the execution. There's some artistic license in the film, but roughly speaking the execution scene is realistic, except in that he is saved, whereas in reality he wasn't. William Maclean was a well-known gentleman highwayman who was hanged at Tyburn in 1750. And it shows in that scene a huge crowd would have gathered to watch the execution. Now, how the crowd responded depended on how popular or unpopular the film was. In some circumstances there would be examples of women actually throwing flowers at the condemned, almost like they were some sort of rock star of their day. There's examples of them even signing biographies and this sort of thing, which is very hard to imagine. But basically that sort of public execution was literally a family day out. As dark as that sounds, that's what it was. It was a form of public entertainment. Now the irony about the death penalty in Britain was that the purpose was obviously to reduce crime, but because the crowds were so huge, and because at this point there was no organised police force, it actually increased crime, because there would be a lot of pickpockets in the crowd. There's examples also of serious safety problems. I have come across 4 different cases of disasters happening during executions: 1698, 1726, 1747, and the worst that I came across occurred in the year 1807 at another location which I'll talk about in a minute, Newgate. And in that occasion there was a crowd surge, and as many as 50 people may have been suffocated to death. If you can imagine, the nearest equivalent we would probably have today is a rock concert or a pop concert. Imagine in an open park the sort of crowds that you might get at that. If anyone went to the Live 8 concert in London in 2005, try imagining that sort of crowd. Now, the largest crowds ever recorded at public executions in Britain were roughly those sort of numbers. It's not an exaggeration. When Jack Sheppard and Jonathan Wild were executed in 1724 and 1725 respectively, there was massive crowds turned up for those executions, but very different responses. Jack Sheppard was very popular with the public. Jonathan Wild was the exact opposite. Wild was a thief-taker general, so some might say it was karma, because he made a trade a living out of implicating other criminals. In the end it turned out he was a very notorious criminal. Well, when he was executed, I'm going to have to go into another video here, so bear with me. But yeah, I'll go into another video. Okay.